Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the organizing and scientific committees, I'd like to welcome you all to the 9th International Symposium on Justice, Justice and Liberation. We've been holding this event since 1997, and this year we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of John Rawls' birth and 50 years of his magnum opus, A Theory of Justice, and of Gustavo Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation. And we'll be also paying tribute to the philosophical and theological works by Professor Manfredo Araújo de Oliveira, who turned 80 in February. Now we'll proceed to our opening panel with 2 lectures by our keynote speakers. A former doctoral student of Rawls, Professor Catherine Audard, is the chair and co-founder of the Forum for European Philosophy and teaches at the London School of Economics and Political Science. One of the major interpreters of Rawls, Habermas, and critical theory in the US, Ken Baynes, is professor of philosophy and political science at Syracuse University. Let me announce the titles of our speakers on this panel. Catherine Audard is giving a talk on democracy and reason. Are the cognitive and moral requirements of public reason excessive and unrealistic? Kenneth Baynes will give his talk on right and recognition. Thank you very much. Please, Catherine, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nythamar. I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight with you because, of course, I mean, I've been involved in working on the theory of justice and political liberalism, etc. for a long time. I translated the theory of justice into French. And so I'm absolutely delighted that we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the publication. But also I would like to mention something more personal. Nythamar was a guest at the Department of Philosophy at the London School of Economics some years ago, and it's really lovely to meet again. And also something else, which is that when I will mention it in my paper, but I always thought there was a special connection between Rawls' realistic Utopia and some trends in German philosophy, especially Ernst Bloch, Geist der Utopie and Prinzip Hoffnung, and also, of course, the theology of liberation. So I was amazed that you put together these 2 fields or domains, I mean, which are not usually connected, because for me, there is a real connection between the 2. So I slightly changed the title of my presentation because I published recently a paper with the title, The Cognitive and Moral Demands of Public Reason Are Unrealistic, Excessive. I mean, that's a paper I'm publishing in Dianoia, which is an Italian journal, and I published it in French before that. But I'm expanding a bit my paper, and I really would like, I'm going to talk about more generally reason and democracy. Is that a utopia? And I will develop the idea of the transformative power of public reason. So, given the present situation in world politics, to claim with Rawls that a reasonably just, though not perfect, democratic regime is possible, or, and it's the well-known quotation, it's possible for there to exist over time a just and stable society of free and equal citizens, sounds outrageously utopian. The appeal to public reason to overcome conflicts and reach a lasting consensus has been undermined by the rise of populism, of anti-experts, anti-science, complotist opinion, etc., and even the demands for more authoritarian regimes all over the world. And you know, the index on democracy is getting really lower as measured at the moment. So we seem to experience at the moment a return to the Dark Ages in contradiction to Kant's principle in What is Enlightenment, that to test whether any particular measure can be agreed upon as a law for a people, we need only to ask whether a people could well impose such a law upon itself. This sounds extremely utopic. The level of polarization and conflict is such, even in traditional established democracy, that any kind of consensus between warring parties is a disappearing prospect, and appealing to reason against passions sounds deeply outdated. This is the reason why, in the light of present political events, Rawls' appeal to public reason seems typical of his lack of realism. Rawls sounds to many as having no sense of politics. This is a very widespread criticism, and of the unsolvable nature of class and culture wars. I won't insist on this widespread criticism as it is well known. However, I would like to try and bring a different interpretation of what Rawls claims to a realistic utopia means. You know, that's the famous paragraphs in Justice as Fairness, a restatement, where he explains that political philosophy is a realistic utopia. So I will start with some remarks on utopia and its various meanings, inspired by my own past work. And I will then show that Rawls' reference to Rousseau to characterize a realistic utopia as taking men as they are and institutions as they should be is somehow misleading. I would suggest another interpretation based on Hegel and on the nature of reason in history, showing the transformative power of public reason. And that's really the subtitle of my paper, The Transformative Power of Public Reason. And I will conclude with examples showing why the appeal to public reason is not as unrealistic as it sounds. First, a few remarks on utopia. I would say, quoting Kant, that utopia is an ideal of productive imagination. And I appeal here on the distinction in Kant between productive and reproductive imagination. Often utopia is seen as a poor inverted copy of reality, a pure work of reproductive imagination. For instance, in Thomas More's Utopia, if you remember, the toilet seats are made of gold, just to invert reality. That's the throne is in gold. So that's typical of reproductive imagination. Utopia would be a poor, empty construct, just inverting reality. But you can look at it differently as the work of productive imagination. And I quote Kant here, productive imagination produces original representations not derived from experience. In contrast to empirical imagination, and Kant adds something which has inspired Heidegger's book on Kant, it is a blind but indispensable power of the soul. So this, we can look at utopia as a methodology, as the result of rational imagination, a methodology that produces a reversal of viewpoints, a heuristic tool to distance oneself from the so-called reality and to see it through a different angle. And this variation will show, as Rawls says, that the limits of the possible are not given by the actual, or not fully given by the actual, for we can, to a greater or lesser extent, change political and social institutions, and much less. I'm quoting Justice as Fairness. So utopia, in my view, should be seen as one of the, belonging to a range of tools of rational imagination, such as the ideal types in Max Weber, counterfactuals, etc. So it belongs to a group of tools which I would describe as if thinking. Example as if thinking, as if reasoning. And the main example is, of course, Kant's categorical imperative. We should act as if the rule of our one's action were a universal law. So it's the as if thinking which is here typical of productive imagination. And I would like to go back to my own experience. When I started my studies in Paris, I was studying with Raymond Aron, and I was working on millenarism, Utopia, Thomas Münzer, and Ernst Bloch, Prinzip Hoffnung. And actually, I translated into French. That was my first work. I translated Geist der Utopie into French. And at that seminar, which was absolutely amazing in Paris at the time, nothing like that existed. You had very hard line right-wing thinker against anti-Marxist like Alain Besançon, and also a Colombian theologian of liberation. I can't remember his name, but he was there. And we had very lively discussions. So at the time, I thought that rational imagination was at work too in the theology of liberation. So I saw its main principle, as for Hegel, in the creative and spontaneous nature of Geist through history. Religion is an expression of Geist as any other cultural creation. And it seemed to me at the time that the 18th century contrast, the Enlightenment contrast between reason and religion was no longer tenable. When I moved on much later to Rawls' theory of justice, I was struck by how close Rawls' idealizations and the device of the original position were to some kind of utopian constructs, and could be seen too as products of rational imagination. Discovering later in Justice as Fairness that he thought of it as a realistic utopia comforted me in my assessment, and I insist on that on my non-mainstream interpretation of the original position as the work of as-if thinking, like Plato's cave or Kant's categorical imperative, and not simply the result of rational choice. It is a methodology that discovers the sources of normativity in rationality, but not as the sole normative concept. And I quote political liberalism here to make that clear, to see justice as fairness, as trying to derive the reasonable from the rational, misinterprets the original position. And the theory of justice is definitely not part of the theory of rational decision, as some have suggested. So that's my non-mainstream interpretation of the original position. This is the reason why I was really fascinated by the rapprochement you established in this conference between liberation theology and Rawls' theory of justice, which I would define as a liberalism of hope. In both, Prinzip Hoffnung is at work, and I was really very happy to support Nythamar's project today. So my first question is Rawls' realistic utopia really modeled, as is mentioned, on Rousseau's approach, on Rousseau's social contract? Now, in what sense is the theory of justice, and more specifically, the appeal to public reason, utopian, realistically utopian? To answer, Rawls quotes repeatedly Rousseau as his inspiration, taking men as they are and institutions as they should be. What does it mean for Rousseau? On the one hand, realism means taking human nature as a given. Here, Rousseau was innovating as he took his inspiration from Hume, not from 18th century materialists like Lamétrie, D'Holbach, Deleuze, Mondeville. Human beings for him, and in the discourse on the origins of inequality, are motivated by two main natural sentiments: self-love on the one hand, but also sympathy. So realism here means that reason is not the main motive for action, but it's, as Hume said, a slave to passion, because reason cannot motivate people to act, only sentiments can, according to the sentimentalist school of philosophy, Hutcheson, Shaftesbury, and Adam Smith, of course. So realism, as seen in Rousseau, taking men as they are, means these two dimensions, self-love and sympathy. And of course, that's something you find in Rawls with the two main moral powers. On the one hand, the conception of the good, of one's good, self-love. On the other hand, a conception of justice, sympathy, and the need for cooperation. So in that sense, Rawls seems to be true to Rousseau's inspiration. Utopia now. For Rousseau, institutions could be improved upon through critical reasoning, which was exactly Thomas More's view on, for instance, property rights, money, etc. As soon as you started critically reasoning on the present situation, on property, money, etc., you saw that it was deeply irrational and unjust. So when people can reason and deliberate freely, they can see the injustice of their institutions and can free themselves. So reason as the vector for emancipation. Examples in Rousseau of how unjustifiable the constraints of the law appear, how arbitrary they are without any collective agreement before. And Rousseau really developed this contrast between authority and arbitrary coercion. So always the test for legitimacy should be based on rational agreement. So that's really the utopian dimension, this role of reason, which is typical of the Enlightenment, of course. However, there is a contradiction in Rousseau's view. If good institutions fashion good citizens, this means that human nature cannot be a given. In reality, Rousseau's program was based on a fixed view of human nature, which in turn may deliver a dangerous and illiberal aspect of utopia. The aim of institutional reforms or revolutions is given in advance, which leads or may lead to repression of dissent and pluralism. As is clear in Rousseau's style and in his conception of the general will, see, for instance, Isa Berlin, I mean, that's absolutely central, I mean, the critique of monism and 18th century rationalism. So this point was well answered in Hegel's conception of Geist. To avoid Rousseau's illiberalism, institutional design needs a philosophy of history that helps to build on past experiences and models. And an amazing example is the Federalist Papers, when the founding fathers tried to draw a constitution for the new country. They took their inspiration in Athens and in Rome, of course. So history was there at the back of their work, not on abstract reasoning. And typical of this abstract reasoning, which is denounced by Isa Berlin, is Rousseau's confusion between unanimity and legitimacy. And that's really the main weakness in the general will, of course. So I'm not too, it's not too unsubstantiated, sorry, to say that Hegel is the inspiration in the Rawls here in overcoming this contradiction between a human nature, which seems to be a given, and institutional progress and design. And you know how often, in the end, Rawls quotes Hegel, aim at reconciling facts and ideals, the real and the rational. Unfortunately, the success of liberal democracy, that is popular sovereignty plus the rule of law plus free markets, over communism in 1989, has for some signaled the end of history, Fukuyama, and has led to the dangerous, unrealistic utopia of universal application or globalism, nation building, and some form of neo-colonialism. We, the winning side, now know what is best for humanity to prosper, and we will apply it worldwide. This is the well-known danger of utopia when it is cut off from a philosophy of history, as it is in Rousseau. So my next point is a question: how does is really managing, is Rawls really managing to avoid that kind of dogmatic institutional design? There is certainly a number of difficulties in Rawls' theory. For instance, the sense of justice, which is seen as a moral power, moral capacity of any citizen, seems on the one hand to be a given, on the other, the result of living within the context of democratic institution for a long enough period. It is not clear that the choice of whether the choice of first principles of justice is a historical event or simply an ideal situation modeling. If a sense of justice is needed to create better institutions, how can this sense of justice be the result, as Rawls claims, of living within just institutions? There is here a virtuous circle, which is unexplainable. And Amartya Sen's criticism seems valid in his idea of justice, his criticism of Rawls. Human nature is not a given, as it seems to be for Rawls when he talks about normal, quote, human beings, as his theory assumed normal human beings, but Sen says humans are fashioned by their environment, their particular conditions, levels of development, health, culture, etc. So any truly realistic utopia should be rooted in social, cultural, and historical facts, which doesn't seem to be the case. Can this contradiction or paradox be solved? In my own view, Rawls needs a philosophy of history to give his realistic utopia content and credibility. That humans fashion history and fashion themselves through history, as Rawls quotes in Justice as Fairness. In other words, Rawls should insist on the transformative power of reason to give credibility to his realistic utopia, a vision of the just society which is rooted in historical and social facts, possibly also on psychological facts. So this is the connection between realism and utopia should be found in a transformative view of reason. So that's my next point, public reason as a transformative process of both human beings and institutions. I would like to show now that the demands of public reason as described by Rawls are not unrealistic on condition we accept, as Rawls does, the Kantian distinction between facts and values, between theoretical reason and practical reason. Practical reason for Kant frames for itself with perfect spontaneity an order of its own, according to ideas, to which it adapts the empirical conditions. The limits of speculative reason confronted by what is do not hold for the practical use of reason when it determines what ought to be. And I remind you of Rawls' definition of practical reason. Practical reason is concerned with the production of objects according to a conception of those objects. For example, the conception of a just constitutional regime taken as the end of political endeavor. So if you look at reason as a power of production, as spontaneity in a way, even if Rawls doesn't go all the way with Kant, I mean, on constructivism, still, this the heart of the conception, this conception of reason is production, the capacity to product ideas and reality institutions. So if you look at Kant's criticism of the rationalist illusion, you have now a good way to understand Rawls' realistic utopia. The rationalist illusions for Kant is based on the definition of reason as theoretical reason, and that leads to the power of experts. And that's really at the heart of the debate in contemporary politics. I mean, the power of expert, the power of those who know over the ignorant. The force of reason, the power of reason, of theoretical reason, then would replace one domination with another, which contradicts the egalitarian and inclusive ideal of democracy. The diversity of individual opinions would result entirely from a lack of education and from cognitive and moral deficits that can only be overcome through access to education and the enlightenment of reason. Such a view is prevalent in the contemporary criticism of populism as a view of the uneducated. And here I think I should mention Michael Sandel's recent book on meritocracy and the contempt for the uneducated. Once irrationality, ignorance, and false consciousness are overcome by the religion of reason, to quote Thomas Jefferson, and the necessary competence are developed, political consensus would be possible in the sense that all beliefs would eventually converge. This is again a monological consensus based on unanimity, as for Rousseau. And that's the same mistake, this confusion between unanimity and legitimacy. On the contrary, taking, as Rawls claims to do, seriously the diversity of world views and interests means to see it as the result of both theoretical and practical reason, of the exercise of reason in lasting conditions of freedom. This is the meaning of reasonable pluralism, an expression which has been deeply misunderstood, and in fact, which is a historical fact, not a utopia. This leads to revising our conception of reason and to accept that it has a historical dimension, lasting conditions of freedom of thought, protection for basic rights, etc. This may solve the dilemma. Human nature is not a fixed given, but develops and has a purpose, which is the meaning of Geist, but that purpose is only revealed in specific historical conditions, such as democracy and the rule of law, freedom. This sounds like Rawls' reading of Hegel to me. So the only way, that's my claim, the only way to make sense of the expression realistic utopia is to feed into it a philosophy of history and of the transformative nature of reason. To conclude, I'm taking an example to illustrate this, how this appeal to public reason is not unrealistic. In political liberalism, Rawls used a specific example, that of Martin Luther King, this public discourse in favor of desegregation, and the changes it underwent. I'm choosing a different example, which is the public discourse of British Muslims between 1989 and 2006. The representative bodies of British Muslims and the evolution of their public discourse up to the 2006 Incitement to Religious Hatred Act shows this transformative power of public reason. 4 stages mark the evolution of the public discourse of the Muslim Council of Britain, and of its predecessor, created in 1989, at the time of the publication of the Satanic Verses and the Rouge d'Affaires. This publication and controversies around it, and especially the fatwa declared at the time, was the start of the constitution of a new collective identity. British Muslims, not as a group based on race or ethnicity, but based on religion. the entry into the public sphere with identity claims of a religious group, and the transformation of these claims into properly political ones, and their broadening to the socio-economic domain. So the first step, the Rushdie affair. I won't expand on that, but it was really impressive to see how it was the origin of a brutal realization by Muslims in Britain of their religious identity, terms in which they had never before defined themselves. This stirred public opinion across the whole of civil society and drew in the wider British public around the legitimacy of the reaction of devout Muslims to Rushdie's book. The British Muslims entered the public arena as a religious minority, whereas until recently, the state had ignored the importance of religion for Muslims. Not being an ethnic group, Muslims were not protected by law, while Jews and Sikhs in Britain were. They therefore tried to raise the British public's awareness that the importance of Islam could not be understood by the vague and simplistic term culture, that it was neither a race nor just spirituality, but the source of their self-respect, solidarity, security, all of which are primary goods in Rawls' sense, and absolutely crucial for vulnerable minorities. Second step, after this, to explain their indignation to the British public, the Muslim organization therefore initially used religious language to non-public reasons to express their protest in the political arena. And they used the term apostasy to describe Rushdie's criminal conduct and what they felt was intolerable. That's the third step. Faced with incomprehension, they then explained that it was a blasphemy. In both cases, these are what Rawls would call non-public reasons that are incomprehensible to anyone who is not Muslim or religious. But this strategy can be explained by the fact that the representative organization of British Muslims first worked to bring into the public discourse a new common identity, one that was properly religious and Muslim and not simply ethnic. So that was their entry into the public debate. And no cultural or ethnic minority had previously occupied the stage in such manner. And the next step was really crucial. Existing legislation in Britain, Northern Ireland's Incitement to Religious Hatred Act, was used to denounce the satanic verses as guilty of incitement to religious hatred. Anti-Islamic acts and speech have gradually fallen under this law since its enactment in 2006, on the same way as anti-Semitic acts and speech are covered by the law. However, this shift from race to religion is not simply a repetition of identity politics. It reflects British Muslims' still modest use of public reasons, that is, argument that can be understood by all members of society, regardless of their philosophical or religious views and identity. In some ways, Muslim organizations, with this law in 2006, have helped to liberalize UK legislation in relation to religion, a liberalization that has benefited other groups by challenging an overly narrow and debatable understanding of the relation between church and state and its implication for religious discrimination. The exchange of arguments of public reasons has strengthened the democratic constitution of a common culture and a common bond. Finally, far from confining themselves to religious demands, these organizations were keen to combine these with socio-economic demands. The gateway to a pluralist host society is a moderate, self-aware, and respected Islam, not full assimilation or integration. What have the British Muslims achieved? Integration, full allegiance to liberal democratic values? Probably not, as subsequent developments such as the terrorist attacks in 2005 have shown. The situation has changed completely when the political authorities interrupted the dialogue with the MCB from 2006. But at least an entry into the public debate on an equal footing with other minority groups was initiated thanks to the transformative use of public reasons. Let me conclude now. As the example I've used has shown, the main obstacle to the public use of reason is not that it is an unrealistic utopian ideal, given what men are, but the social and political conditions, the historical conditions of its use, and the scope for its transformative potential. The problem is not the lack of competence or capacities of some sectors of society, but somehow the lack of openness and pluralism of the host public space. It is very important, for instance, that British society at the time was open enough, it's no longer true, unfortunately, was open enough to learn from the grievances of devout Muslims, as long as they were expressed in public reasons, and to transform consequently. In that sense, the appeal to public reason is an expression of trust in democratic institutions and tradition in which it is embedded. It is an expression of a liberalism of hope, which is possibly a better description of Rawls' theory than a realistic utopia. Two questions at least remain, however. Was the use of public reason by British Muslims really a first step in their emancipation process? Is public reason one central vector for emancipation and liberation, or was it simply a means for assimilation into mainstream culture? Second, how far goes social criticism in Rawls' political liberalism? Is it world-changing, as the theology of liberation has been or wanted to be, or too modest, as some critics have said in the 70s? I would say that at the moment, this first quarter of the 21st century, it seems stronger than ever, given the recent attacks on democracy and the remarkable resilience of liberal institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Audard, for this brilliant lecture. We have a couple of questions here. One question. As an expert as well on Rousseau and the French reception of liberalism, having translated, of course, John Rawls' A Theory of Justice and many of his writings, do you think that Jean-Jacques Rousseau could be regarded as a liberal reformer as opposed to the oft-portrayed communitarian, as seen by many who read Rawls' reconciliation of the liberties of the ancient and the modern as a liberal response to communitarian critique?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, it's very interesting because when I first read The Theory of Justice, and then when I translated it, I thought the French would be attracted to Rawls because of his continental outlook, the fact that he relies on Rousseau even more than on Locke in a way, and that he tries to reconcile liberalism and republicanism in a way. So I thought that would be attractive for the French public. But unfortunately, the term liberalism in France and on the continent mostly is the opposite of the meaning it has in the States. I mean, I wrote a big book called "What is Liberalism?" And I really quoted, took an example, an awful book called "Liberal Fascism" by a right-wing writer, seeing really liberalism as as bad as socialism, let's say. And when Hillary Clinton was a candidate, she was asked if she was a liberal, and she said, no, I'm a progressive, not a liberal, you see. So the question is really, Rousseau had one foot in the 18th century still, so he was not a liberal reformer in that sense. He translated the old monarchy, the old authoritarian regime into a new republic, but unfortunately, his vision of popular sovereignty was very close to royal sovereignty, as has been explained. So I think in a way, the connection with liberalism doesn't work there.
Thank you very much. Another question here by Daniel. One of Amartya Sen's criticism of John Rawls' theory is exactly its distance of reality in determining an ideal theory of justice. Public reason seems to me to use the comparative approach defended by Sen and not by Rawls. In this sense, the notion of a utopia appears to be far from the public deliberation. Also, when provided with an end, it could be constrained to function fully, even because an ideal justice could not think about all future problems that could occur. How could public reason bridge this distance between utopia and realism, since it takes history and reality at stake?
Oh, gosh, it's the big question. Public reason develops within certain historical conditions. So it's not a historical ideal. It's a historical fact, the fact of education, the fact of generalized education, access to the public sphere by many people, etc., etc. I mean, if you look at our societies, I mean, our multicultural societies, I mean, you have a number of communities who don't speak the language, who don't access the public space, but progressively through education, their non-public reasons can become intelligible or expressed. So I think at the heart of what is meant by public reason, you have the public, and the public is not something abstract. It depends on liberties, on basic liberties, on rights, on protection of freedom of thought, freedom of expression. I mean, that's really, I won't go back to Habermas' book on the public sphere, but it's a historical concept. So as soon as you put public and reason together, you put history and ideal or transhistorical faculties or powers together, you see. So when I talk about the transformative power of public reason, I'm talking about the public dimension of reason here, which is obviously a historical fact, which can't exist without institutions, without education, universities, but open press, media, etc. So that would be my answer. I'm not talking about reason in the abstract. I'm talking Rawls talked about public reason. That's something very specific.
Thank you very much. Once again, now the floor is open for anyone who'd like to raise a question or make a comment. You may as well open your mic and speak up, or write down your questions on the chat. Okay. There is another question here. How do you see the role of a public reason in the present situation of England, given all the criticisms raised against Brexit policies, do you think that public reason has played any kind of role in terms of reaching agreements?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think the failure of Brexit is a failure in a sense, I mean, because it was imposed by a slim majority upon a minority, and the whole process was flawed. I mean, there was no how do you say? I mean, nobody thought of putting rules, you know, that 60% of the population should vote, etc. I mean, you know, so it was a disaster. A referendum is a disaster in democratic terms. So, and really the debate again between Brexiters and Remainers was flawed from the beginning, because it was expressed in terms of the ignorant, the uneducated on the one hand, and the educated elite, who knew what was best for the country, etc. I mean, it's similar to Hillary Clinton when she described, what was the term she used to describe the opponents? I mean, the electors of Trump, the despicable or something like that. I mean, so it was really never expressed in terms of public reasons. It was really content, passions, and the Remainers in Britain. I mean, I've been active, I did my best, etc. But I was afraid that they were not showing any understanding for the reasons of their opponents. So the debate was not at the level of reason, it was at the level of short-term interest, and really all biased by contempt and misunderstanding. So I think that's really the flaw in the present political debates in the States, in Britain, I suppose elsewhere. It has been phrased in terms of contempt and absence of recognition of the demands or the grievances, which are really understandable. I mean, there was no understanding, really, no public reasons in that sense. I mean, and the public space here was really biased. I mean.
Thank you, Catherine. Professor Baynes has a question.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Clinton's phrase was basket of deplorables. That was very unwise choice of terms. I'm very sympathetic with your unorthodox reading of Rawls, and will pursue a similar interpretation in my own remarks. But I wanted to play the role of the critic for a moment. Can't one argue that in shifting from Rousseau to Rawls, there's actually, I'm sorry, from Rousseau to Hegel, there's actually a loss of a certain notion of individual freedom or liberty, and even Hegel's remarks about the limited value of public opinion and so forth suggest, right, that there may be a more democratic moment in Rousseau in this notion of the right of subjectivity, what Hegel called the right of subjectivity, that Hegel thought maybe could be too easily reconciled with what he called the right of objectivity, even the right of history.
Yes. Well, Rousseau is a paradox, because on the one hand, he's really the hero of subjectivity and the defense of the private realm and originality and creativity, etc., as an artist, as a writer, etc. But on the other hand, I mean, don't forget what he wrote, these terrible words: you will be forced to be free. I mean, that's something, and you know why? It's because of this notion of unanimity. And, you know, I mean, there is no room for diversity, for pluralism. Whereas not enough, I mean, not really, no, honestly. And that's why he was so important for the French, because they created, you know, France is a nation who has created the state. I mean, the state has created the nation. The unity of the nation was forced upon a diversity of cultures and languages, etc. And Rousseau was really the way to legitimize the state, the authority of the state upon this diversity, because unanimity is the sign of the general will. So there's no room for dissent. That's why I'm really so critical of Rousseau. And it's really interesting that Rawls described Hegel as a liberalism of freedom, right? Not a liberalism of happiness. So that's really interesting. It's provocative. But I think in the principle of the philosophy of right, he has a recognition of this individual bourgeois freedom of the new century. So
thank you very much. We got a question from William.
Hi, thank you, Professor, for the lecture. I'm also wondering if you're reading, I'm very sympathetic with the reading of Rawls with Hegel, but if we take that reading to the full extent, maybe are we missing, is Rawls missing, or does he cap?
Sorry.
Because then...
Sorry, can you repeat, because I missed that.
Oh, okay, okay. Does Rawls, with a Hegel forward reading, does he keeps his liberal neutrality, his abstention from the ethical position? Because then we have some very maybe tough conceptual things to reconciliate. So maybe, I don't know if you think about in these terms, but maybe Rawls does not attach with something as substantial as Hegel because of his position on the ethical position.
Well, I mean, it's the question is, Rawls doesn't want to be seen as a dualist. So the tension you have in Kant between facts and values, between the real and the rational, which is overcome in Hegel, this tension tends to be underwhelming in Rawls, because he doesn't want to be a dualist. And I think he should be a dualist to be true to this, to his Kantian inspiration, but he's not. So his realistic utopia is a way of reconciling facts and values, the real and the rational, etc., or to show that there is a way. So how do you manage that? I mean, either you develop a tragic conception of reason, as in Kant, where you can't reconcile the world as it is and the world as it should be. And there is always this tension, and that's something because of the human condition you can't overcome. Or you are an optimist like Rawls and Hegel and think that there is a possibility of a just, quasi-just society in the future, etc. So you see, I mean, so if Rawls is consequent, coherent, I mean, with himself, he has to be some kind of Hegelian in a way. I mean, you see what I mean? Huh? So that's, I know it goes too far. I mean, it's a comprehensive doctrine, but that's the only way you can. And when he wrote about Hiroshima and Auschwitz, I don't know if you know the passage on Auschwitz, he says, we don't want the Nazi to win, so we need to keep hope, because to abandon hope is to justify the Nazi. So you see, I mean, there's a religious dimension in Rawls, obviously, a kind of teleological dimension, yes. There's a purpose. So that's why the rapprochement with the theology of liberation is really inspiring.
Okay, thank you, Professor Audard. Any further questions? Please, we still have some time. Feel free to raise your questions or share your comments. Okay, we have now two questions. Ken and Julia.
Just quickly, Catherine, I have one question about the as-if reasoning. And your last remark prompted the thought. I mean, there's this other reading of Kant, right, that we have to think of ourselves as if we're free. We also have to think as if there will be a final reconciliation of happiness and virtue, as if there must be a world in which perpetual peace.
Yeah.
This seems like a slightly different kind of as-if reasoning than what you were suggesting, if I understood you correctly, with this the need for kind of productive imagination that goes beyond the actual. And I wonder if you've thought about this other strand.
Well, I mean, there are two strands. I mean, the methodological one, as in Max Weber's ideal types, you know, as if, and that's useful for theoretical reason to understand. But there is also the other trend in practical reason, as if we could realize this idea, I mean, as if it was possible. So you have the trend of theory, I mean, theoretical reason, and it's very important, I mean, for the social sciences, I mean, everywhere, this as if thinking, and also in practical terms. So, I mean, it's the puzzle is really what spontaneity means. If it is, as Malebranche said, la folle du logis, I mean, the crazy, the craziness of imagination, or if it is the methodology of as if, I mean, yes. No, I agree. I mean, there is a tension, and it's quite complex. I mean, you can't put everything together, but still, the sources of transformation are really in imagination. I mean, and its capacity to move the outlook and to move the viewpoints. I mean, so that's really, I mean, not to be stuck with the present, with the real as it is. I mean, and that's very powerful.
Thank you, Catherine. Professor Julia Moura, please.
I mean, you find the as if thinking in all ways.
Thank you, Professor Catherine Audard. It was very interesting, fascinating to hear you. So my question is on reconciliation. This is a point of view that I am also pursuing in my work recently. And so I have a question regarding from the theory of justice to political liberalism, when Rawls realizes that the congruence argument, that that would be an issue. So how the focus on reconciliation and the focus on Hegel So I would just like to hear you on this, if you think that he felt the need to focus on this idea of reconciliation due to the problem of stability, and how, because when you look at the lectures on the history of moral philosophy, you can see that probably it was a focus that he started bringing attention in his work, Justice as Fairness, a Restatement, when he opens it saying that political philosophy has like two ways to go, orientation and reconciliation. So I think that sometimes when we talk about reconciliation, we're still talking about orientation. And sometimes I feel that the questions are all in the Hegel system and not in this idea of what is being reconciled, and why Rawls felt that we need this reconciliation in order for the wholeheartedness of the conception of citizens in a democratic world.
No, you're absolutely right that the question of stability came up later. I mean, he describes his first version of the theory of justice as unrealistic, because it assumed that people could be reconciled, could think in the same way. I mean, that's also, again, I mean, unanimity. And he realized that it was absolutely, it was in contradiction with the modern condition of diversity, conflicts, and pluralism. So, yes, I mean, and it's interesting because the question of stability is an empirical question. How strong, how solid our institution is something which is really dependent on empirical economic conditions, political conditions. So philosophy is not really at ease with this question of stability. So it's really interesting that the later Rawls was much more interested in history and social condition and reality than the first one, obviously. But at the same time, I think it's a question of style. That he wanted to put the method of the original position in terms that would be, as he said, sub specie aeternitatis. I mean, that's something which could be understood from any angle, any period, etc. And then he realized that he was talking about the conditions specific, the specific conditions of a democracy, not in, of any situation. Yeah. And the need for stability and reconciliation in modern democracies is central, because freedom generates plurality, diversity, and conflict. So that's really the main issue. And when people say that Rawls is not conscious enough of the conflictual nature of modern societies, it's not true. I mean, conflicts are really at the heart of it, of his thinking. I mean, on the need for justice. I mean, the two are inseparable.
Thank you, Catherine. There is another question here from Alexandra. The Rawlsian solution to the problem of utopia seems not to take into account the initial challenge of living in an unjust society, such as ours, towards a well-ordered, just society. Could this passage not be considered as a critical point of his theory?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's the question of progress and transformation, yes. Well, I mean, what he provides us with is very limited. It's a kind of moral compass, you know, to guide us through the storms, I mean, through the upheavals. But we are not leaving an unjust society and entering a new world. I mean, it's not that. I mean, it's always something which is at work in all the social movements, in all the revolutions or upheavals in society. So it's a compass, a moral compass to travel through all these upheavals. I mean, but you are never on the dry land. I mean, you are always in the middle of tempests. I mean, yeah. But I would say, I mean, I want to be an optimist, and I would say that in this year, institutions have managed to resist the assaults. I mean, and really, I mean, one can be hopeful still. I mean, they're not doing very well, but still they manage. I mean, so there's hope.
Thank you, Professor Audard. Another question here, actually a couple of questions. First question, Professor Audard, the growing digitalization of both daily communications and reflexive discourse is exerting a huge impact also on the political public sphere. Electoral process, for instance, are being profoundly affected by social networks and conversational apps all over the world. How do you see that comprehensive process of digitalization in relation to public reason?
Well, I would say that social media and the new daily communications are not public. They are networks, but they are non-public reasons. I mean, the argument exchange are defining identities, communities, groups against each other. It's a we against the other, but it's not the public. I mean, the public sphere is destroyed, is weakened by this type of communication, because when you go public, you can't say anything. I mean, it's impossible. You have to discipline yourself. And it is the lack of discipline or self-restraint, which is really the hallmark of social media. I mean, people just express themselves, but I wouldn't describe that as public reasons, definitely not. But maybe one day the public sphere will change and there will be some kind of self-restraint and rationalization or anything, I mean, of communication, but we are not there yet.
Thank you, Catherine. There is another question here from Professor Emil Sobotka. Thank you very much, Catherine, for your inspiring lecture. My question, Exodus from Egypt in symbolic sense was a radical utopia of liberation theology, but it was, to some extent, a gift from God. Theology made from this a call to solidarity rather than to democratic action. Could you talk about how you see the connection and similarities between this as if of liberation theology with the as if approach to democracy that you've been arguing for?
Well, if I were truly Hegelian, I would say that these are various expressions of Geist. And the unity of Geist is really behind the, the theology of liberation, and behind democracy, because democracy is really a Christian notion when you think of it. I mean, it's based on fraternity. You can't ignore that. I mean, it's impossible. So I don't know. I mean, that's a big question. I don't think I can answer quickly.
Thank you, Catherine. Any further questions? We still have a few minutes left. All right, folks. Well, Professor Audard, once again, thank you so much for this beautiful lecture, for this wonderful discussion. And we'll proceed now to our second lecture by Professor Kenneth Baynes of Syracuse University on right and recognition. Professor Baynes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. in fact, you'll see that I share a kind of unorthodox reading of Rawls that I think you might also find sympathetic, Professor Audard. So thank you. I'd like to thank Nythamar and the other organizers of this conference as well. It's very unfortunate that we can't be meeting in person. It's always a much better occasion for exchange of ideas, discussion, but I hope there'll be some of that here this afternoon as well. I'd also like a little historical reference to say what a privilege it is for me to participate in a conference on Rawls and Gutierrez together. As some of you know, most of my work has centered on engaging critical theory with the tradition of Rawls and analytic political philosophy in the States. But in fact, my own origins began in theology as well at Harvard Divinity School, where I was first introduced to liberation theology. And in fact, it was the work of Segundo on the liberation of theology and Jose Miranda, Marx in the Bible, that first introduced me to critical hermeneutics, what hermeneutics was, and that in turn finally led me to Habermas and the Habermas-Gadamer debate and so forth. So that was in fact my own origins, and I still find myself pulled back there in some of my reflection, even though I don't write on the topic of religion very often. So as I just mentioned, a great deal of my work has been an attempt to place critical theory in some sort of discussion with the work of Rawls and post-Rawlsian political theory, and in particular, interpreting Rawls's political turn and his political liberalism to some of the work of Habermas, especially on the topic of public reason. So I'd like to start by recalling a few themes of my own earlier work. These are going to inform what I want to talk about this afternoon on the relation between right and recognition, and to anticipate what I have in mind here is a bit of a engagement between Rainer Forst and Axel Honneth. So first, in an early essay, I defended what I called in the literature is called the political conception of human rights, which I would still defend today. I think a lot of the debate about what Rawls initially meant by a kind of political conception was misunderstood. I don't think for him it was primarily a functional view of human rights, that is, what would trigger international intervention or conduct on the part of other states. I think for Rawls, the idea of a political conception of human rights had a lot to do with the question of the associational relations that individuals stood to one another. This points to the question of whether at the cosmopolitan or global level, the appropriate associational ties are there. That's a debate that continues, but I think it already pushes Rawls a bit in the direction of what I would call a recognitional theory. In another short piece on Rawls in critical theory in a volume edited by John Mandel on the work of Rawls, I emphasized the fact that I thought both Rawls and Habermas defended a practice-based approach to normative theory, to theories of justice, This in contrast, for example, to people like Jerry Cohen, who argued that normative theory had to be completely fact insensitive, and Cohen developed that as a way to criticize Rawls, and I defended there Rawls's own practice-based conception, which again I think is much closer to Hegel's own view of justice. I also pursued in an article on the equality debates a defense of Rawls's view on social equality that was decidedly not a luck egalitarian view. This is another debate that's continuing in the post-Rawlsian literature, luck egalitarian versus social egalitarian theories. And I again defended Elizabeth Anderson and others who offered a relational egalitarian reading of Rawls that again, I think point to the fact that there are some recognitional dimensions to Rawls's work that undergird, lie at a deeper level than his own views about distributional equality. And finally, in my book on Habermas, I proposed that in the section on Habermas's discourse morality, what I called a dialectic of moral and political constructivism. And I, of course, had in mind, again, Rawls's own political turn and the notion of political constructivism. And although others have used the same term, Rainer Forst, for example, speaks of a relation between moral and political constructivism, I think I appreciate the demand and force of political constructivism more than Rainer Forst does. And this, again, puts me a little bit closer to Rawls and to some who talk about the priority of politics over morality. And I would still defend this as a kind of reading of Rawls as well. So given this sort of reference to some of my earlier work, I'd like to approach my topic this afternoon by discussing briefly two recent conferences in North America that sought to bring together also the traditions of critical theory on the one hand and analytic, moral, and political theory on the other. And I'm going to then indicate some reasons for me that both of these conferences were very disappointing. Maybe better stated, they indicate how difficult this kind of cross dialogue between very different traditions can be. Looking at the topics of this conference, many others may appreciate the challenge and difficulty of this sort of cross dialogue. As we'll also see, the interpretation of Rawls plays a very important role in each of these conferences. So the first and most recent was a conference at Yale in 2018. Some of the papers have just appeared in the European Journal of Philosophy. The conference was an attempt to bring together the work of Axel Honneth on theory of recognition and the work of Stephen Darwall on the second person standpoint and second person reasoning. And one might think that this should be a really fruitful exchange from 2 points of view that really one would expect to have a great deal in common. Darwall's work on the second person standpoint, as some of you may know, begins with this often cited example that he uses. If you step on my foot, I can appropriately ask, maybe after requesting you to get off of my foot, why did you do that? And if the normal excusing conditions are not present, for example, if it turns out that you weren't yourself shoved or pushed by someone else, the response will often be one of resentment or indignation. And as P.F. Strawson argued, it's these reactive attitudes that undergird our practices of blame. Now, Stephen Darwall, following Strawson, sees these reactive attitudes as indications and perhaps maybe even constitutive factors in interpersonal relations that Darwall calls the second person standpoint. Now, some of you also know in his book, Darwall goes to some great length to show that the appropriateness of this question and the relation it assumes between the parties can, in fact, be traced back to the work of Fichte. And in fact, Darwall calls the second person standpoint Fichte's point in his book. So this again suggests that given the relations between Fichte and Hegel, and then from Hegel to Honneth, that there'd be a great deal in common between Darwall and Honneth, and that this would be a very fruitful exchange in this conference. The immediate results, however, were quite surprising and quite different from what one would have expected. Darwall interpreted Honneth's theory of recognition as essentially just social theory that had little to do with normative inquiry. At best, Darwall suggested it might be a contribution to non-ideal theory, but not ideal normative theorizing. His second person standpoint, by contrast, is not a claim about how agents in fact relate to one another, but as he put it, a steadfastly transcendental claim about how persons must relate if moral claims are to obligate. And for me, a quite remarkable comment. Darwall sees his work as a contribution solely to normative theory, or better expressed, he sees moral theory itself as primarily a kind of transcendental inquiry into what moral value is, an inquiry that's quite independent of social or, for that matter, psychological facts. Darwall draws an analogy, for example, between legal positivism in order to show that normative facts have no bearing at all or no relation at all to social facts. And his inquiry, his normative inquiry, is about, if you want, normative facts, quite different, again, from the way he read Honneth's theory of recognition. In his own reply to Darwall, Honneth similarly expressed bewilderment that his own theory of recognition could have been read as a contribution only to social theory and not as an exercise in normative theory. And he voiced his own reservations as to whether Darwall's second person standpoint could be sufficiently broadened to include a second person plural, or to what Honneth calls the we perspective. Again, we should, of course, think of Hegel's Geist, and whether it could incorporate a notion of the malleability or alterability of moral norms and normative perspectives themselves, what Honneth calls the conflict or struggle for recognition. Now, for me, an especially revealing moment in the exchange came in Darwall's remark that his suggestion about the second person standpoint must be one that Rawls too would have to accept. And he specifically referenced Rawls's remark in Kantian constructivism and elsewhere of the person as a self-authenticating source of valid claims. And Darwell's comment was then Rawls must also accept something like the value that I'm identifying with this second person standpoint. Now, at this point, to my mind, we find ourselves in the midst of the still very much ongoing debate about the significance of Rawls's political turn and the meaning of his political liberalism, since Rawls clearly carried over the description of the person as a self-authenticating source of valid claims to his description of the citizen in political liberalism. So there is at a minimum here the question of what it might mean to claim that Rawls's account of the basic powers of the citizen, that is his understanding of this notion of a self-authenticating source of valid claims, would mean to say that it presupposes a normative analysis of the second person standpoint that is fact insensitive or independent of any social facts. Does his political conception then assume the results of this type of normative inquiry? Again, one that's fact insensitive and independent of any facts about social reality. Again, for those of you who know, this is exactly the debate between G.A. Cohen and Rawls about the type of normative inquiry behind the theory of justice. It seems to me that Darwell is in danger, like Cohen, of failing to appreciate the significance of Rawls's political turn. And I'll give a good reason for thinking this in a moment. First, I want to suggest why Rawls is indeed much closer to Honnett's own recognitional theory than anything like Darwell's transcendental inquiry. I noted above that elsewhere I've defended the view that Rawls, like Habermas, have a practice-based view of justice. That is, Rawls does not think there's a clear notion of rational justification or proof, no deriving a theory of justice from the terms of the rational alone, as Professor Audard referred to earlier. Further, as Rawls put it in A Theory of Justice, justification proceeds from what all parties to the discussion hold in common. Thus, mere proof is not a justification, unquote. Then finally, for Rawls, such processes of justification assume participation in a shared practice, or in Rawls's own language, broadly, a shared basic structure. This view has been, I think, widely and successfully defended by Aaron James and many others, including myself. The claim, in my view, implies, again, that Rawls is a recognition theorist if we understand, as I believe Honnett does, forms of recognition to be structures of justification. So let me return for a moment to Darwell's claim and suggest why I think something's gone terribly wrong. However paradoxical or odd it may sound, for Darwell, the justification of the second person standpoint is not itself second personal. This remark about a steadfastly transcendental justification of the second person standpoint, I think, is committing him to what Elizabeth Anderson and others have called an impersonal or third personal justification. It moves from what can be justified to others, the Rawlsian idea of justification, to the question of what moral value is or must be like for anyone who takes up the question if there's to be value at all. And this, again, I'm suggesting is a very different project than what Rawls engaged in. I want to turn to the second North American conference that I mentioned at the beginning. And this is a conference that took place in Canada between Arthur Ripstein, a leading neo-Kantian legal theorist, and Rainer Forst on the other hand. And that work too has been published in a recent volume called Constitutionalism Justified, a bunch of essays on the work of Rainer Forst. The topic was Forst's claim that the most basic human right, the only one innate human right, was a basic right to justification. Indeed, Forst's claim is that the most defensible interpretation of Kant's claim that the only basic and innate right is the right to freedom is Forst's own basic right to justification. So Forst is sort of in a way that Ripstein offers a reading of Kant's innate right to freedom, offering an interpretation of Kant in connection with this basic right to justification. As Forst puts it, the most basic human right is, I quote, a right to justification, a right that assumes the equal standing among all persons to be both authors and addressees of norms of justice, unquote. Now, in contrast to Darwall's reading of Honneth, it must be said that Ripstein offers a much more careful and sympathetic reading of Forst than Darwall offered of Honneth. Nonetheless, Ripstein concludes that there are two possible ways to understand Kant's innate right to freedom or independence. That is, the right not to be subject to the will of another. To be sure, Ripstein argues, both are relational and both are non-foundational conceptions of this basic right. But Ripstein thinks there's nonetheless a crucial difference between the two. On one view, this basic right asserts the equal status of each person not to be subject to the will or domination of another. On the second view, the right to independence asserts the right of each to be his or her own master. In Kant's term, the right to be sui juris. Despite the similar emphasis, the latter, more Kantian view, according to Ripstein, secures a private space in which each person is, quoting Ripstein, quoting Kant, beyond reproach, which Ripstein interprets to mean not obliged to provide justifications at all when there's no question of a conflict of right. He calls the first broader view, the co-deliberative conception. And he calls the second narrower or more strictly Kantian interpretation of this, basic innate right. Now, to summarize a much longer and detailed discussion, Ripstein again agrees with Forst that this innate right is relational. That is, it's a right that belongs to a self or a subject, not just in virtue of his or her humanity, as the expression goes, but rather is a right that presupposes a person stands in a special relation to another free and equal person. However, Ripstein suggests that Forst's account, like Scanlon and Habermas and some others, is in the end the first account that I gave, that is this co-deliberative conception, in contrast to the narrower or more strictly Kantian reading about the status of a person as not subject to the will of another person. Ripstein believes there are several reasons to prefer the second account over the co-deliberative conception proposed by Forst. The most important of these, however, seems to be that the co-deliberative conception simply leaves too much up for grabs. It leaves too much indeterminate with respect to just what one can deliver from a conception of a basic or innate human right. In other words, for Ripstein, the content of individual rights, how far a person's liberty rights extend, for example, will depend on whether or not other parties to the co-deliberative process believe that they have good reasons for rejecting the scope of the proposed right. Whether, for example, a basic right to liberty includes a right of a person to extensive freedom of speech, or the scope or range of protection to one's own body, will depend on whether co-deliberators have or believe they have good reasons to object to a more expansive interpretation. Crucially for Ripstein, his Kantian view puts the right bearer beyond the obligation to provide justification when it's not an issue of right. And secondly, his Kantian conception of the basic right to freedom has nothing to do with what he calls material interests, but rather solely with the protection of the person sui juris, that is, of the person's status as not subject to the will of another. In terms of the current debate about human rights, Kant's innate right to freedom or independence, Ripstein argues, is not an interest-based view. And that's the problem he sees with many other interpretations, including Forst's of human rights. Now, let me make two further remarks on the debate to put off some possible misunderstandings. First, Ripstein does not think that a full set of basic rights, say, for example, the rights and liberties included in Rawls's first principle, the liberty principle, can be directly derived from the one innate right without any further institutional specification. I think this would ignore precisely what Professor Audard referred to. There's a history behind the interpretation of the rights included in the liberty principle. Nonetheless, he thinks the innate right does impose severe constraints on what others can demand or what can be open to a demand for justification. Relatedly, on Ripstein's view, a large role is played by the claim that the innate right more or less directly demands a distinction between public and private right, or public and private law, and the corresponding political institutions charged with defining the range of and scope of basic rights. The distinction between public law and private law, which does follow from the innate right, establishes not only a horizontal relationship now among citizens, but also a vertical relation between citizens and a public authority, if you want, the popular sovereign. Political authority has the task of protecting the rights of persons to be their own master. They're not up for grabs again in the way that Ripstein believes the co-deliberative conception does. A second qualification, Ripstein does concede that even on the co-deliberative conception that Forst has proposed, other constraints must more or less be immediately introduced. Everything can't always be up for grabs all the time, so to speak. And this is a point that Forst expands upon in his own reply. Nonetheless, Ripstein continues to insist that the co-deliberative model fails to secure a near inviolable status of a right bearer, something again he links to the idea of human dignity or human worth, in a way that would ensure his interests will not be sacrificed or fall prey to the competing interests of others. The interest-based model, which he thinks again the co-deliberative conception is also committed to, is the wrong way to think about what human rights are. It views the domain of right as one in which persons can expect and demand justification, and as such, one in which a person is therefore not secure in his or her right to be above reproach. Now, once again, interestingly enough, in the effort to drive home his point, Ripstein takes issue with some remarks by none other than John Rawls in Rawls's theory of justice. Rawls considers a case that might arise under conditions of partial compliance. More specifically, a case of a real threat of civil unrest. We might think many of us in Brazil and the United States today, not so hard a case to imagine. But the case is one in which, according to Rawls, a person might be held criminally responsible for the possession of firearms in his home, even though the person was unaware that the weapons were there. As Rawls goes on to argue, this application of the notion of strict liability would seem to violate the principle of ought implies can, and so constitute a clear failure to treat a person as above reproach. Rawls argues, whether this is troubling to you about Rawls or not, that nonetheless, this restriction of a person's basic liberty may be justified to protect the liberty of others. In Ripstein's view, this compromise of individual liberty exactly points to the kind of failure in the Rawlsian approach, in its failure again to protect this nearly inviolable right of persons not to be subject to the will of others. The co-deliberative model fails for the same reason. Now, I won't pursue Forst's own response. He suggests that he doesn't really want either of these two views. He wants a third position somehow in between. And as Forst himself admits, there's a sense in which he wants to have his cake and eat it too. That is, he wants to claim that the demand for justification goes all the way down, while at the same time insisting that there are some rights that are, as he puts it, I quote him again, quote, Forst, are beyond normal justification because they are fundamentally justified on the grounds that they secure the equal standing of persons, unquote. Now, first, to repeat, one feature of Ripstein's critique of the co-deliberative conception is that an interest-based account, that it is an interest-based account. That is, that Forst's view is also, the co-deliberative view is also an interest-based theory, since this is what individuals must be considering when determining whether or not they have good reasons to object to a particular right. This seems to me to be correct. But as Andrea Sangiovanni and others have pointed out, the success of Ripstein's own position will depend on showing that it's possible to distinguish in a relatively clear manner between cases in which the agent is subject to the will of another, that is dominated another, has his or her status violated, and those in which he or she is not so subject without any appeal to the fundamental interests of persons. Sangiovanni and many others consider cases that suggest it will be very difficult for Ripstein to do this. Secondly, and I find this reply by Rainer Forst especially interesting. Forst raises some reservations about the sort of justification Ripstein offers for the innate right to freedom that echoes the reservations I expressed above about Darwall's defense of the second person standpoint, namely that it's an impersonal or third personal justification, not a second personal. Forst suggests that Ripstein's defense of the innate right to freedom reduces justification to, quote, a demonstration of mere consistency, unquote. That is, once again, Rawls's idea that justification is always justification to others is substituted for a third personal or impersonal model of justification based on the idea of a deductive proof. By contrast, Forst insists again that his view is relational or impersonal all the way down. in the specific sense that, quote, precisely because no rights are beyond fundamental moral political justification, they all express relations of respect that have to be justified in relational terms, unquote. And I would suggest this is exactly what we should reasonably have expected the idea of the second person standpoint to have required. So where does this leave us? We'll move toward my conclusion. The justification of basic rights, and perhaps even the fundamental or innate right to freedom, if we agree with Rawls that justification is not the same as a deductive proof, but always justification to others, requires a structure of justification. That is, it presupposes an institutional background or set of shared practices for justification to proceed. It requires, in other words, forms of recognition in the way that Honneth and others have suggested in some of their works. In fact, the title of one of Honneth's books on Hegel, I think, expresses the challenge facing more Kantian-based approaches wonderfully. The title of that book is Suffering from Indeterminacy. William will appreciate that. Attempts such as Ripstein's to define basic rights fail to provide the determinacy that they so often claim. This is more or less Sangiovanni's critique of Ripstein as well. Providing the needed determinacy will require acknowledging and then specifying in greater detail the background justificatory structures or forms of recognition upon which they draw. This is, in my opinion, a serious challenge to views that seek to be fact insensitive or practice independent in the way that views like G.A. Cohen's claim. At the same time, however, much more needs to be said about how rights are to be justified in connection with determinate forms of recognition, and how this more Hegelian approach can avoid the charge of historicism that Forst and many others raise against this Hegelian, broadly Hegelian, and even Rawlsian position. This is also Forst's critique of Rawls's political conception in his book, that it doesn't address the problem of ethnocentrism or historicism. I can't offer much in the way of response to these challenges today. I would close by saying that in contrast to Rainer Forst's position, the view that I develop in my book on Habermas pursues this idea of a dialectic between moral and political constructivism. You can't, in my view, slide all of the moral constructivism, whether it's Habermas or Scanlan or Forst, into the political conception. This violates the political view that not all citizens will share that moral conception. On the other hand, I think more does need to be done on the political constructivist side to clarify what these structures of justification or forms of recognition are in which the justification of basic rights would proceed. But I'll end on that note. Thanks very much. Sorry if I went a bit over time.
Thank you so much, Professor Baynes, for this thought-provoking lecture. One question here. How do you think John Rawls' practice-based conception of social justice might help us bridge the continental analytic divide and misunderstandings on the normative grounds of social critique, especially in light of Steve Darrell's criticisms raised against Axel Honneth's theory of recognition? Shall I read another question, or you rather go one by one?
Let me start maybe
Okay.
one by one, but I'll
All right.
try to be brief. I mean, here I think my allegiances are clear. I think that for better or worse, one has to run with the practice-based, fact-sensitive approach that Rawls develops in his political turn, that, in my view, puts me a little closer to Honneth than it does to Forst, though the disagreements between me and Forst may be more a matter of emphasis. It also expresses my sympathy for a more Hegelian approach than a strictly Kantian or Kantian constructivist approach on the continental side of some of that literature. But of course, you know, there's an enormous amount of literature in the recognition theory stuff about forms of misrecognition and how a view like Honneth's can respond to them, and whether they can respond successfully to those challenges. And a view many have criticized Honneth's view as itself a bit too complacent with the status quo in exactly the way people have criticized Hegel's Rex philosophy as being a bit too complacent with the structure of modern institutions, the state, the family, the modern economy, and not open to challenges to criticisms of them. So I have to embrace now the need to respond to all of those challenges that are made against views like Hegel's and Honneth's as well.
Thank you, Ken. Another question here from Sam on YouTube. Professor Baynes makes a thorough case. This is my question to him. The 21st century reality is one where the individual belongs to a community. Basic rights and participation as presented by Rawls and Hegel are becoming too classical, abstract, and irrelevant. Digital technology makes it possible to belong to a community and never ever bother to participate or insist on any right or state institution. In this case, what form of civil society is most likely to replace the classical society that Rawls and Hegel proposed to reflect on our current reality of, first, individualism, second, communitarianism, third, driven by technology? How can we interact to maintain a healthy society within these three competing forces? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a large question. I might refer you to an article that you can find on my academia site on the possibility of global civil society and the idea of democratic institutions beyond the nation state. I have a couple of papers there. I agree with you that Rawls's own reflections didn't develop sufficiently the idea of post-national political institutions. James Bowman, who just recently tragically passed away, has a nice book on this topic as well, of democracy beyond borders. There's a great deal of work, and I agree that there are associative ties and associative relations that are emerging in a global civil society beyond the nation state. I'm not sure that digital technology alone provides that. I shared again some of the views expressed by Professor Audard about these aren't public spheres, but the absence of public space. But I think there are public spaces, and public spaces that might be aided by digital technology in NGOs, in informal public spheres beyond the nation state. And that's where I would try to develop in ways that neither Hegel nor Rawls addressed this idea of transnational or post-national political will formation, as I would like to call it.
Thank you very much. Professor Baynes, there is another question here, if I may. Do you think that on Ripstein's interpretation, if proportionality analysis turns out to be a central means to achieve the unification between liberal and communitarian normative claims in their right to justification, according to Forst's terminology, wouldn't this rise of proportionality as a general standard of rationality end up detaching the normativity of constitutional law from its local origins? That's the question.
Yeah, thank you. I have to say that I'm not myself well-versed in the discussions of the principle of proportionality and the way in which it's brought to bear on balancing or proportioning different rights claims in a way that would conform to the requirements of Ripstein's own project. So I have to beg off of that aspect. I do like the idea very much, though, of the idea of human rights being incorporated into local, national constitutions that then become a kind of basis or leverage point for expanding the reach and scope of human rights. Shayla Benabee, Professor Benabee, one of my teachers, has written and worked on that topic some, and as have others as well. And I think that's an exciting way of looking at the dynamic between human rights that are not yet binding in the way that constitutionally enacted rights are, to make them more constitutionally binding.
Thank you so much, Ken. Now, register for Q&A, William, Ana Paula, and Josiva. William, please.
Thank you, Professor Ken. Thank you for the shout out on the suffering from indeterminacy. It was, we found much of the time talking about this book. It's a very good book. But my question, it's on this divide within the justification. Within political philosophy, they are maybe, what should I call it, strictly analytical. I think that it has a deeper question that calls to the forefront the question of what should philosophy be? Should philosophy be the judge, or should philosophy be an instrument and should be enable democracy? Should be philosophy the judge of democracy, that judging whether this is wrong or right, or should be an instrument for democracy? I think you agree, but this is the question that comes to mind when I come to see this sort of kind of only strictly egotistical views of justificatory means.
Yeah, thank you, William. And again, as you know, probably here, I think Habermas just misread Rawls in the exchange between them. Habermas suggested that Rawls was treating the argument for the principles of justice as some kind of philosophic demonstration or proof. And in his reply, Rawls pretty strongly rejected that description of his project. He doesn't think that philosophers are independent of or outside of or engaged in some process of delivering up to democracy what the correct principles of social justice are. He understood his argument rather to be a kind of contribution to the wider community to bring into the discussion of what, again, principles of social justice would look like. I mean, philosophy is in an odd spot. It's supposed to be more than just reading great books, reading texts, but as again probably came out in my remarks, the idea that what it's doing is engaged in a kind of Darwell's phrase, steadfastly transcendental argument, or a strict deductive proof that applies to anyone who chooses to engage in normative theory, I think misunderstands what philosophy is or how philosophy works. I'm much, much more drawn to Hegel's remark that the owl of Minerva only spreads its wings at dusk. That is, it's interpreting the forms of recognition, the structures of justification that have already taken shape in the world. That's my much more explicit nod to a Hegelian motif.
Thank you, Ken. Another couple of questions. First question from Professor Ana Paula Forman. Thank you, Professor Baynes, for your wonderful talk. My questions: would you please elaborate more on the content of the concept of justification? Furthermore, what's the differentiation, if there is any, between not only justification and legitimation, but also justification and legitimacy of rights in John Rawls?
Yeah, that's another very large question. Not quite sure where I should jump in. Of course, many have pointed out that political liberalism was a theory of legitimation, offered as a theory of political legitimacy. That's also what his conception of public reason was presented as. And so arguably different from the project in a theory of justice, which was to give a articulation of the kinds of commitments that Rawls believed were already present somehow to the liberal democratic society that he was engaged in this project for. Now, there are other remarks about some specie eternitatis at the end that I think we have to maybe just let some of those comments go as late night writing, or that's not fair. But so the question of what justification is, and the question of political legitimacy, for me, are much more dovetailed with one another. Even one of the questions in the first session had to do with what Rawls and then Habermas called the two stages in political liberalism, whether there's a kind of justification of the two principles, and then the question of whether they would be stable over time. I don't see those two questions as being so independent of one another. And that again poses harder questions about even then what you think the project of justifying principles of justice might be, that they're not so removed from the question of what political legitimacy itself might look like. That probably only raised more questions in response to your own, but those are hard questions, I think, for me anyway.
Thank you. Professor Baynes, a question here from Professor Joseph Van Geddes. Thank you very much for your talk. Concerning the relationship in critical theory between recognition and law, how do you think the role of law in the process of recognition and emancipation? For example, the role of law in Honnett's theory of recognition and or in Forst's theory of normative justification in terms of emancipation and resistance against oppression.
I am still a kind of fan of Habermas's own argument in between facts and norms, where this is again one of these questions about how fact insensitive your theory can be. Habermas takes what he calls the modern legal form as a given, as a fact. He doesn't try to give an independent moral justification for the legal form. That's something that I think Professor Forst criticizes Habermas for, thinks that Habermas's view in between facts and norms is too functionalist, not a normative defense of the rule of law. I myself find more satisfying that strategy that Habermas proposes, and then the idea that he develops at the end of that book. It's really the basis for my own thinking about the dialectic of moral and political constructivism, between what Habermas calls law as norm and law as fact. And in that distinction between legal fact and legal norm, Habermas sees the potential for innovation and change. I mean, that's where, for example, he locates feminist jurisprudence and the limitations of the dominant legal paradigm and need for new innovation. I like that strategy of the relation between law. What does the rule of law mean? How is it developed and expanded to the point really where rule of law has to mean not only law that is whatever this might mean, not made by men or not made by people, but is a general to the idea that only norms, legal norms that are democratically enacted could satisfy the condition of genuine law, satisfy the principle of rule of law. I've argued for that briefly in a short piece that you can find on my webpage too. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, Professor Baynes' academia webpage was written down here on the chat, just in case. Now,
what an opportunity for self-promotion.
Of course, we should take advantage of this important moment here. And I'm gonna read another question here by Daniel. Thank you, Professor Baynes, for your lecture. By itself, it seems to me that the struggle for recognition cannot be justificatory. It needs a medium, what Hegel would call Vermittlung, to become a moral justification. In this sense, the recognition theory would need not a normative theory, but a kind of theory of public reason. Would force theory not only be compatible with Honneth, but even necessary? What do you think?
Yes, I agree with that, and I suspect Forst would agree with the remark I'm about to make as well. The theory of recognition needs to also include, and in my view, Habermas again clearly does this, a public sphere that includes a strong defense of civil protest, civil disobedience, challenges to the way in which current institutionalized forms of recognition may also be forms of misrecognition. So Robin Selicati's, William Scheuermann, and a number of others have argued convincingly, I think, on the importance of protest, civil disobedience. And if I understood your question, your remark, that struggles of recognition, struggles for recognition that are not yet institutionally recognized or institutionally secured, that can in turn modify or change those institutions. But when those struggles fail or don't achieve uptake in these wider institutions, then rights aren't secure, rights aren't even yet acknowledged as rights at the appropriate level, right? That is, claiming a right on the part of a protest is maybe a first step toward realizing, securing a right, but it's only that. And protest needs to then translate into modifications in social and legal institutions. I think that is, I have a very broad view of moral argumentation. My view, moral argumentation is kind of a debate that takes place very broadly in the public sphere. There never will be a kind of isolated moral discourse that takes place, and I'm not sure where, a philosophy seminar room or something like that. I mean, that's crazy. I don't know if that helped or if that rambled a bit, but struggle for recognition, protest are a necessary component of a vibrant public sphere, and that can change the structure of the public sphere itself.
Thank you, Ken. Daniel says, I agree with you, Professor Baynes. Thank you. We have two more questions. I have a question myself, and William has another question. My question is very quickly to see what you make of Derek Parfit and others who referred to Rawls' contractarianism, but very much in a way that would be susceptible to this criticism you raised against Jerry Cohen's fact insensitivity principle, right? So I understand that this is a major line of your argument, right?
Yes, I mean, Parfit's strategy in that massive work was to claim that there is not a deep conflict between Kantian utilitarian or consequentialist and contractualist modes of reasoning, but they were, so to speak, grasping different sides, portions of the same elephant. And that if you could get a sufficiently distanced perspective, you could see them as all being a part of this larger whole. I think for Parfit, it was a desire on his part to defend the project of a secular ethic, of a non-religious ethic from a kind of internal collapse among warring parties. But I share the worry that you alluded to at the end, that this shared perspective for Parfit is in the end a kind of impersonal standpoint. In Nagel's book, right, the point of view from nowhere. And whether that's a fair criticism or not, I'm not really in a position to assess. But certainly from what I read on and worked on Parfit on the equality debate, he landed on the luck egalitarian side of that debate, not the social egalitarian side. And again, as Elizabeth Anderson argued, and I developed it in my short piece, I think that's looking at, equality from some kind of point, would the world overall be improved if there was more equality is not the social egalitarian perspective, this second personal standpoint. And Parfit went for the impersonal standpoint in those debates. So that's why I have those worries, though I haven't labored over his book to form a strong opinion about its success.
Oh, thank you very much. William?
Okay, let's go to the tough question, maybe a toughie, maybe a tough one. So Professor, in my understanding, your view as a practice-based, fact-sensitive project. Okay, so we must have, I'm assuming, a view of morality that is, and I'm quoting here, a class of social norms connected to the legitimacy of a social order and responsible for the integration of individuals as singular or unique into that social order. Something in that you said of Habermas' view of a morality. So if it is a social norms connected to the legitimacy of a social order that is singular and unique into that social order, how much is why aren't those ethical norms? That's my point. Why is the differentiation, and why is still very important that those are morality norms and different ones are very personal and closely religious, that what they call the ethical norms? Why is this divide still relevant, and why? And I know why it will be problematic eventually, but why is still relevant in your view?
Yeah, thank you, William. For those of you who don't know, William spent a semester in Syracuse and participated in a seminar where we were able at greater length to discuss some of these topics. So that's why he said, all right, let's roll up our sleeves now and get to this. So how do I want to respond to why? I mean, on my understanding, morality becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. It's reduced to something like human rights, which then enables and makes possible a plurality of conceptions of the good, of ethics, of diverse notions of human flourishing that can vary from polity to polity as well, even in a polity, right, that might embrace the set of moral human rights. So that's that's a kind of projection about understanding what morality is, and then the difference between morality and I know what also concerns you, this kind of liberal neutrality debate, and this question of ethical plurality, I think would not be so great. I also don't know how else to think of morality except as social norms of a certain sort. And I defend this view in the case of Habermas, as Habermas's reading, as essentially a kind of Durkheimian view of morality, where what these specific social norms are doing is on Habermas's view, protecting the inviolability of the person, the freedom of the person to take yes, no position, maybe even this notion of not being subject to the will of another. But that's a very kind of thin protective measure that enables a flourishing of a great diversity of forms of the good or ethical lives. At least that's how I sort of see that doesn't mean that these ethical conceptions can't always still play a role to nudge or challenge or reignite untapped moments in the moral conception itself. I would agree with that view. That again, I see that as a broadly Habermasian conception of what discourse morality is and what role it plays. And I know you're familiar with it, but for others, I labored quite a bit over the chapter on just what discourse morality. I think it's even a mistake to call it discourse ethics, as Habermas called it. That points to the very confusion you were just indicating in my chapter on morality in the Habermas book. One more plug, hopefully one last. Thanks, William.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Baynes. Is there any further questions or comments? I know Professor Baynes must be exhausted by now, but once again, thank you so much for this brilliant paper and very engaging discussion. We had very, very interesting questions, and your comments and response were very, very much stimulating for all of us. Once again, thank you, Professor Baynes. Thank you, Professor Audard, for this great time we had together. And we'll have a coffee break, perhaps a long coffee break, before the next talk by our good friend, Maria Clara Bingemer. Once again, thank you all and see you all later. Bye-bye. Thank you, Ken. Take care. Stay healthy and safe.